So I'll introduce our first speaker, who is Marcos Nadal. He's an assistant professor at the Department of Psychology of the University of Balearic Islands. His main research focuses on the evolution, neural correlates, and function of cognitive and affective processes involved in aesthetic preference and art appreciation. And he is a great advocate of the renovation of taxonomy within psychology to identify the study of empirical aesthetics. So I very much look forward to hearing your contribution, and I'll let you take the word. Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Let me see if I can. So I guess you can see my PowerPoint, can you?
Yes, I can see it.
Super. So thank you very much for everyone who made this seminar possible, and thank you very much to everyone for attending. It's actually a pleasure and an honor to be part of it. So I'll do my best to make it clear what I think aesthetics is, or rather what I think it should be, from the perspective of a psychologist like me who's involved in neuroscience. So psychological aesthetics is mostly concerned with aesthetic experience. Much of the work that's conducted in psychological aesthetics aims to describe and explain aesthetic experiences in psychological terms, and also sometimes in neurobiological terms. My main argument today is going to be that aesthetic experience is a concept that we can do without. I have used the concept of aesthetic experience extensively myself. Until recently, I also conceived aesthetic experience as the main object of study of psychological aesthetics and neuroaesthetics. But the more I understand the history of our discipline, the stronger I feel that the concept of aesthetic experience has to go. So let's get down to business. What is aesthetic experience? For Emery Schubert and colleagues, an aesthetic experience involves the contemplation of objects that express beauty and induce positive affect. Ed Wessel and colleagues conceive aesthetic experience as hedonic experiences afforded by the perception of objects that have no immediate value for survival or for the satisfaction of basic needs. Elvira Bratico and colleagues believe that an aesthetic experience requires a specific aesthetic attitude, intentionality, attention, and an appropriate context that induce particular aesthetic emotions. Markovic is very explicit about aesthetic experiences being exceptional and qualitatively different to everyday experiences. According to him, they involve fascination, appraisal of the symbolic reality of an object, and a strong feeling of unity with the object. Alexis Makin stresses that aesthetic experiences are fundamentally about intense emotions, such as rapture, sublime, intense fascination. This comparison is interesting because these are conceptions of aesthetic experience developed in the last decade by active researchers in psychological aesthetics. They are either referring to different experiences, or they are emphasizing different aspects of the same experience. And if this were the case, it seems that aesthetic experiences, at least for psychological aesthetics, are usually positive experiences that arise from the contemplation with an aesthetic attitude of the beauty of objects that have no survival value and involve intense emotions that are specifically aesthetics. This would be a satisfactory definition if only we could agree on what an aesthetic attitude is, on what beauty is, and what aesthetic emotions are. But what all of these definitions have in common is the assumption that aesthetic experiences are special kinds of experiences, that these experiences involve specific psychological and maybe even neurobiological processes or functions, and that understanding these special aesthetic experiences requires special explanations. How did we come in psychological aesthetics to conceive aesthetic experience in such a way? The answer to this question is a long and complex story, but I will try to tell a short and simplified version. There are two main reasons, and they are intimately intertwined. The first of these reasons has to do with social and intellectual transformations during the 18th century in Europe. Here, we find intellectuals debating about how to classify the arts. One of the most popular classifications involved separating fine arts from the mechanical arts. The fine arts were those that imitated and perfected nature, and their only purpose was to provide pleasure. Whereas art requires inspiration and genius, crafts require merely skill and a knowledge of convention. This division implied a difference between what was expected from art and from craft. It began to be considered that craft could only produce ordinary pleasure by being amusing or useful. In contrast, art was expected to produce a refined and even elevated pleasure, an aesthetic pleasure. The separation of art and craft, the elevation of fine art above craft, and the definition of a special form of aesthetic pleasure were not motivated by any knowledge of human behavior or human cognition or human neuroscience. These distinctions between fine arts and craft were not intended to reflect meaningful psychological or behavioral boundaries between creating and appreciating art and craft. They were intended to reflect differences between those who could afford art and those who could not. Art became a commodity, and good taste and refined aesthetic pleasure became the proper way to appreciate art and a sign of social status. Noel Carroll summarizes this for us. Aesthetic experiences emerged in the 18th century because it supported the standard classification of the arts, with fine arts at the top, at the pinnacle, and because it became a sign of social distinction, with those powerful and wealthy enough to afford art at the top. So, the concept of aesthetic experience emerged historically, not from an understanding of human behavior or of how the brain works, but as a way of elevating a particular class of activities above others and a particular class of people above others. So the concept of aesthetic experience we have in psychology today is a lasting consequence of this inequality. Intertwined with these social factors, we find the work of philosophers whose thinking paved the way for the concept of aesthetic experience in psychology today. We find Shaftesbury, who introduced the idea of a sense of beauty as the capacity of cultivated minds to understand harmony among parts. This understanding needed to be disinterested. But Shaftesbury's overarching philosophical program was to reject Hobbes' ethical egoism. So when he says that judging harmony among parts has to be disinterested, he's meaning in a moral sense, as opposed to self-concerned, personal advantage, and the private pursuit of one's own ends. The next philosopher we find in this path towards the psychological understanding of aesthetic experience is Hutcheson. He took Shaftesbury's idea of the sense of beauty a step further and conceived it as an internal sense responsible for the pleasure of perception of complex qualities that exhibit some form of arrangement. But the correct functioning of this sense requires a proper disposition, again, disinterestedness. But to Hutcheson, this means that judgments of taste should be impartial. They should not be based on the prospect of personal benefit or advantage. By conceiving the sense of beauty as analogous to external senses, Hutcheson committed aesthetics to two theses. First, that the aesthetic sense is qualitatively different from other senses and not reducible to them. And second, that there are qualitative features that are uniquely aesthetic. The next philosopher we find along this path to psychological understanding of aesthetic experience is Kant. He's concerned with the universality and authenticity of aesthetic judgment. The main question he's interested in concerns the legitimacy and universality of judgments that are based only on the pleasure of perceptually apprehending something. He concluded that such judgments will be legitimate and universal if humans share common faculties for understanding and if they are disinterested. In this case, disinterested means free from all advantage, including social, political, moral, and religious interests. A disinterested judgment for Kant is a judgment made without interest in the very existence of the object. As we've moved through this path, aesthetics has gradually become more and more separate from other concerns and values, leading to the idea that an aesthetic experience requires a proper disposition or involves a special kind of emotional response. But there's a catch here. Disinterestedness, for Shaftesbury, Hutcheson, and Kant, was not a quality of the experience. It was a condition for making true, legitimate judgments. So, how was disinterestedness transformed from a condition for making a good judgment into a quality of an experience? We find this transformation in the movement of art for art's sake, the defense that the true value of art is art itself, the defense of the value of art against the idea that art has a commercial value, a moral value, or that it is subject to scientific understanding even. Disinterestedness was presented as the opposite to useful. The usefulness of art was not worship or celebration or entertainment. There was no use for art except art itself. And despite the fact that most art throughout history in the world is created and appreciated in the service of religious, political, moral, and other cultural interests, as Carroll writes, the claim of disinterestedness became an article of faith of traditional aesthetic theory. And we might add, it continues to be. Let us just recap for a minute. The concept of aesthetic experience existed long before psychology and long before neuroscience. We should not overlook the fact that the idea that it makes sense to talk about aesthetic experiences as a separate category of experiences, and the way we think about these experiences emerged out of interest and discussions that were totally unconcerned with a scientific understanding of human behavior and cognition. As I've tried to show, aesthetic experience as a concept is linked to social changes that privileged art and the wealthy, to philosophical discourse about truth of judgments, to the appropriation of features of how judgments ought to be, to characterize how experiences are, with the goal of promoting the view that art has no value beyond itself. But when psychology was born in the 19th century, this was the concept of aesthetic experience that filtered into psychological discourse. Like they did with many philosophical concepts psychologists inherited, they felt the need to identify the psychological essence of aesthetic experience. But by doing so, they fell into a trap, the one that William James called the great set of delusions which language inflicts on the mind. Whenever we have made a word to denote a certain group of phenomena, we are prone to suppose a substantive entity existing beyond the phenomena of which the word shall be the name. As soon as people have placed objects, phenomena, or other people into categories, the apparent similarity of items in the same category increases. This is called within-category assimilation. In addition to this, items in different categories start appearing more different than they really are, and this is between-category contrast. And the same thing happened to the category of aesthetic experiences. The kind of experiences that were classified as aesthetic became more similar than they actually are, and more different to experiences classified as non-aesthetics. And this progressed and progressed until the two categories seemed to be completely different. At this stage, the essentialist heuristic kicks in. This is the assumption that items in a category share an essence, a set of common features that define category membership. Many experiments have shown that because the features of essentialized categories are usually unknown, they are surrounded by an element of mystery. The history of psychological aesthetics includes a series of attempts to identify this mysterious essence, the essence of an accidental category that went through the processes of assimilation and contrast. For instance, Alexander Bain believed that aesthetic emotions are gratified by compositions of fine art. These compositions produce a refined and elevated pleasure. William James, in his own trap, defined aesthetic emotion as purely sensory experience, not a result of body alterations, which in his theory define true emotions. James Sully defined aesthetic experience as lacking utility. It is enjoyment for its own sake, free from self-concerns. Ribot distinguished aesthetic feeling from others because it accomplishes no vital or social function. So, in the early days of psychology, aesthetic experiences were distinguished from others in that they involve special aesthetic emotions that differ from other emotions. Aesthetic emotions are elicited by very specific objects like fine art or beauty, involve no physiological changes, and lack social and adaptive functions. These are truly exceptional features for an emotion. It would be reasonable, actually, to reject these states as emotions altogether, given that they lack some of the most important defining features of emotions. But oddly enough, they became the defining features of a special class of aesthetic emotions. We find similar attempts to pin down the illusory essence of aesthetic experience throughout the 20th century with recurring themes. Aesthetic experience as the object of art, aesthetic experience as involving special attentive states, aesthetic experience centered on beautiful objects, a special kind of pleasure, a disinterested kind of pleasure. From this perspective, it seems that aesthetic experiences are contemplative experiences, recreational form of luxury, and completely unconnected to survival. My feeling is that this perspective on aesthetic experience is utterly out of touch with the reality of art, with what art means to people, and with how they respond to it. If you're viewing this artwork with a disinterested attitude, you're not viewing it at all. The reason for this disconnection from reality is that the concept of aesthetic experience, which psychological aesthetics keeps peddling, might have made sense in the 18th century, but it makes no sense in the 21st century. Is there at least strong evidence to believe that aesthetic experience includes some of the components we've mentioned several times already? Is there any strong evidence that aesthetic experience includes a unique class of emotions? Is there any strong evidence that aesthetic experiences are characterized by hard emotions? Menninghaus and colleagues consider being moved as an exemplary aesthetic emotion. But when they survey people for the sort of events that have moved them, they find that deaths, funerals, disasters, friendships, encounters, interactions between parent and children, diseases, confessions, and reconciliations are the events that people describe most frequently as those that have moved them. People are moved by events that affect their relationships, by critical life events, and by political events. They are also moved by nature and art, of course, but these results do not show that being moved is an exemplary aesthetic emotion. If anything, they show that being moved is an exemplary ordinary emotion that people experience in all domains of life. There is no strong evidence to support the idea that being moved by art or by nature is any different in any meaningful or important way than being moved by meeting a friend after many years. Is there any evidence that being moved constitutes a specially aesthetic emotion? No. There is evidence that the sort of emotions people have when they engage with art or nature are the same as when they engage in important events in their life. Because that is, and always has been, what art does. It celebrates, illustrates, teaches, commemorates, reminds us of important and meaningful life events. The idea of art for art's sake is a historical and cultural anomaly. It does not represent art at large. And the associated notion of aesthetic experience does not represent how people engage with art and their surroundings. What about hard, intense emotions? What's the evidence that this defines aesthetic experience? Matthew Pelowski and colleagues, among other things, asked people how often they have had sublime experiences. It turns out that 40% of participants never ever had experienced the sublime. 4 out of 10 people say they have never experienced the sublime. If aesthetic experiences are characterized by such intense emotions as the sublime, one would expect virtually everyone to have experienced the sublime. But it turns out even more that among those who have experienced the sublime, about a third of them have only experienced it once in their life, and another third only once a year. We have to conclude that either such intense emotions as the sublime are not defining of aesthetic experience, or that aesthetic experiences are truly rare events. Psychologists have gotten ourselves into this muddle because we've relied on categories that made sense in the 18th century Europe. As Berline put it, art is not a useful psychological category. Santayana emphasized the motley nature of activities we call aesthetic, a grouping that owes only to historic and literary accidents, some of which I've summarized before. There is no single agency in nature, he writes, no specific organ in sense, and no separable task in spirit to which the aesthetic quality can be attributed. Gibson, again, he wrote that the failure of psychological aesthetics is rooted in the separation of ordinary perception from aesthetic perception. There is only one kind of perception, he writes. Ordinary perception includes what we've been calling aesthetic perception. Philosophers have also questioned the appropriateness of aesthetic experience as a concept. Many philosophers doubt there are properties that distinguish aesthetic experiences from other sorts of experiences. They have called the notion of aesthetic attitude a myth that misleads aesthetic theory. And they have stated that the assumption that aesthetic experiences share a common nature that separate them from everything else is the basic mistake upon which traditional aesthetics rests. Martin Scow and I have argued for the last couple of years for an alternative approach. We have argued that we should conceive psychological aesthetics as the quest to understand why specific stimuli produce specific hedonic values. This view has several advantages. For one thing, it connects the field of psychological aesthetics with other domains of cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience. Specifically, it connects us with the subfield of hedonics, which aims to understand what hedonic value is and how it is computed. And it connects us with decision-making and neuroeconomics, which aim to understand how hedonic values are used to make decisions and control behavior. A second advantage is that this perspective aligns research in psychological aesthetics with what is known about how the brain processes sensory information to give it meaning and value. We attach value to objects as sensory information reaches the reward circuit, which generates varying levels of pleasure or unpleasantness, depending on information from the interoceptive system, on the animal's homeostatic state, and information from the executive system concerning task demands. These mechanisms of sensory valuation enable animals, including humans, to value objects and their features in relation to their expectations, their knowledge, their previous experience, their current goals, and homeostatic state. These mechanisms enable animals to organize their behavior by learning and by generating behavioral dispositions, emotions, motivations, plans, and decisions. And this perspective completely transforms how we conceive our object of study. Whereas aesthetic experience is contemplative, recreational, a form of luxury, and unconnected to survival, sensory evaluation is a function of an active and predictive animal. It is a fundamental aspect of animal cognition. It is necessary for the organization of behavior, and therefore fully connected to survival. What is interesting and wonderful about making and enjoying art is not that it distances, that it separates us from ordinary concerns and survival. What is interesting, wonderful, and actually powerful about making and enjoying art is that it's mediated by basic survival mechanisms that connect us to our reality, to our human and physical surrounding. So, it is time to discard the notion of aesthetic experience. The concept makes no sense out of its historical and sociological context. It perpetuates notions of aesthetic experience and art that belong in the 18th century and that privilege certain activities above others and certain people above others. It confuses features of how true judgments ought to be with experiential qualities. It promotes the unsupported assumption that these are special experiential states. It elevates humans above other animals. And it severs psychological aesthetics from other domains of cognitive psychology and neuroscience. I have argued that people have intense emotions and meaningful experiences while they look and listen to or make art, nature, music, architecture. I have argued that it is worth trying to understand these emotions and experiences from a scientific perspective. And I have argued there is nothing special or different about aesthetic experiences, that it makes no sense to separate the class of experiences we call aesthetic from other classes of experience. People's engagement with art and nature and beauty is important and valuable because they are like ordinary experiences. I would say more, they are ordinary experiences, and that's why they are so powerful. They connect us to others, to our community, to transformative life events, and they express our reality, our hopes, and our dreams. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. For interesting talk. I am sure there are a lot of questions. We'll have a chance to ask them during the discussion. And now our next speaker, Professor Michael Kelly. Michael Kelly is Professor of Philosophy at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and he is the founder and president of the Transdisciplinary Aesthetics Foundation. He argues that contemporary aesthetics is no longer only part of philosophy, instead it migrated to a variety of other disciplines outside philosophy, including neuroscience. Thanks a lot for joining us, Professor Kelly. We look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing it. Thank you for participating in this. I do not have any slides. I can, however, send what I'm reading from to anyone who's interested, or to Nicole and Marina, and from them to everybody else. So yes, I want to talk about transdisciplinary aesthetics. What I see is a shift from the aesthetic as a monodiscipline within philosophy primarily, although also in psychology and other fields, to a version of transdisciplinary aesthetics. And examples of that are, I think, too many to list, but I'll just mention some: aesthetic computing, bioaesthetics, Black aesthetics, decolonial aesthetics, digital aesthetics, disability aesthetics, everyday aesthetics, evolutionary aesthetics, information aesthetics, feminist aesthetics, forensic aesthetics, gustatory aesthetics, migratory aesthetics, of course, neuroaesthetics, prison aesthetics, queer aesthetics, to name a few of those. So what I'm trying to understand is why people are drawn to aesthetics in these different fields, and what sort of conception of aesthetics accommodates or complements what people are trying to do. One of the things I think is most impressive about the emergence of all these different forms of transdisciplinary aesthetics is that they emerged in originally what I'd call unfriendly circumstances because of the anti-aesthetic stance. When they began to establish themselves outside philosophy over the last decade or so, they didn't readily find welcoming homes anywhere. In fact, it would have been nigh impossible to find these forms in the end of the 20th century or in the first decade of the 21st century because of this anti-aesthetic stance, according to which aesthetics embodies a set of ahistorical concepts of art, autonomy, beauty, I talked about judgment and the like, that philosophers have claimed to be universal, but that are in fact Eurocentric, white, racist, heteronormative, and exclusive in other ways of other understandings of these same concepts or related aesthetic concepts. Seen in this light, aesthetics has been an object of critique within contemporary literary and art theory, anthropology, political theory, and other disciplines, being regarded mainly as a pernicious ideology, masking the racism, sexism, colonialism, and other injustices of modern liberal democracies. Today, by contrast, as aesthetics has become transdisciplinary, it has become an agent rather than a subject of such critiques, often directed at the very ideological forces with which it was formerly thought to be complicit. For example, Gayatri Spivak helped to establish post-theory and still is thought to be an alternative aesthetics in her own vision and other people. More recently, she's also published a book called An Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalization, which, helping to develop decolonial aesthetics, exemplifies one of the new forms of transdisciplinary aesthetics. So this underscores the conflicting yet promising picture of aesthetics today, a field once considered ideological by its critics is now a lively transdisciplinary field thriving mostly outside of philosophy, with some of its former critics as prominent voices. The unfriendly atmosphere for transdisciplinary aesthetics outside philosophy helps to explain why any philosophers interested in transdisciplinary aesthetics, if there are any, have not pursued it as vigorously as they might have. But such a pursuit would have taken them into other disciplines, as art history or literary theory, which, as you know, made a turn to theory back in the 80s and 90s, and on the face of it would have seemed natural allies of aesthetics, so I thought. However, such theories were typically hostile to aesthetics for reasons similar to the earlier account of the anti-aesthetic stance. To give contrasting examples, the Clark Art Institute organized a conference in 2001 entitled Aesthetics, Art History, Visual Studies. While visual studies was establishing itself at the time as an alternative to art history and aesthetics alike, art history defended itself against visual studies by distinguishing itself from aesthetics. So the two rival disciplines of art history and visual studies found they had a common enemy, aesthetics. By contrast, there was a discussion at the 19 College Art Association meeting, which took place in New York, called "Does Art History Need Aesthetics?" If, excuse me, if the answer to this question was a resoundingly negative one in 2001, it was generally positive in 2019. There were competing ideas about aesthetics displayed by the CAA panelists, of course, but that's not only to be expected but desired. What happened, however, between 2001 and 2019 to improve the reception of aesthetics within art history? A similar change is evident in contemporary literary theory. Virtually all the leading thinkers that helped to shape literary theory from the 1960s forward, Germain, Derrida, and so on, were anti-aesthetic for some of the reasons already mentioned. More recently, by contrast, one of the main literary theory journals, called New Literary History, published an article by Sam Rose visiting the history of the anti-aesthetic stance in literary theory, analyzing why theorists actually feared aesthetics and suggesting in the end that such fear is unwarranted today, if it ever was. What accounts for the change over the last 2 decades in literary theory's stance toward aesthetics? Such questions about art history and literary theory are not my focus, however, as transdisciplinary aesthetics did not first emerge in those disciplines any more than they did in philosophy. If anything, those disciplines presented obstacles. Rather, the changing attitudes towards aesthetics and these and other disciplines are part of a larger trend in some academic disciplines, and even more so, perhaps, in a number of artistic and activist practices that have turned to aesthetics to help understand and articulate their own social, political, as well as philosophical aims, such as the representation by in art. Given that those aims are outside any one discipline, as well as outside the parameters of the art world and of academic disciplines, the type of aesthetics needed to meet them has to be transdisciplinary. So the viability of transdisciplinary aesthetics depends, and any dialogues about the concept depends in large part, of course, on how people understand in these different disciplines, understand and practice aesthetics. So let me explain what I mean by transdisciplinary aesthetics. And it's a view of aesthetics that I developed. I don't know if I could say it's empirical, but I didn't just make it out of thin air. It was my experience doing the Encyclopedia of Aesthetics, both in 1998 and again in 2014, trying to talk to 800 plus people, getting them to contribute to an topic they had very, very conflicting, if even positive, notions of. And I tried to characterize aesthetics in a way to convince people to participate. And this is what I came up with at the time and have been working with ever since. That aesthetics is critical imagining, making, and thinking about the normative dimensions of art, culture, design, everyday life, and nature. To repeat, since I don't have slides, aesthetics is critical imagining, making, and thinking about the normative dimensions of art, culture, design, everyday life, and nature. It includes critical imagining and making, as well as thinking, because aesthetics begins experientially and experimentally at the level of practice in all these domains, and is articulated conceptually at the level of critical thinking. The different modalities, imagining, making, and thinking, happen simultaneously at times. So if this is aesthetics, and it's focusing on the normative dimensions, I don't want to imply that there's any single set of norms or that there's a philosophical foundation of those norms, because that's actually denial of those efforts is actually what led to and led the different kinds of aesthetics. Aesthetic normativity is metaphysically as well as politically unstable. Accordingly, one of the roles of transdisciplinary aesthetics is to disrupt any appearance of stable norms and critique any injustices or inequities embedded in those norms. In the process, another role is to sustain the instability of existing norms, seeing it as an opportunity to explore and establish alternative norms. The new norms will be unstable too, leaving room for even more alternatives. So the cycle. If this is aesthetics, why does it need then to be transdisciplinary rather than monodisciplinary? Just as the aesthetic experience extends across art, culture, design, everyday life, and nature, perhaps in the way that Marcus was talking about, aesthetics encompasses many of the disciplines and practices associated with these domains. No monodisciplinary approach in research in these areas, whether in philosophy or any other one discipline, could possibly cover this expanded range of aesthetics. If Baumgarten introduced modern Western aesthetics in 1750, by arguing that sensible knowledge is on par with logical knowledge, the result was that aesthetics came to be recognized as a field that bridges these modes of knowledge under the aegis of aesthetic experience running across them. This field is transdisciplinary aesthetics. A further rationale for aesthetics to be transdisciplinary, inside or outside of philosophy, share critical imagining and thinking about affects, beliefs, concepts, principles, purposes, and values, while reflecting on public artifacts made or experienced within art, culture, design, everyday life, and nature. Granted, people with diverse backgrounds will have separate histories and divergent understandings of what they share, if indeed they can see there is any sharing. And this is acutely the case today when intersectional identity politics is prevalent in academia as well as in society at large. The role of transdisciplinary aesthetics in this context is to provide the critical discursive tools for recognizing people's differences, identifying possible conditions of communicability, if not commonality, and acknowledging dissensus as much as consensus, as what we share in the end may very well be our differences. If people have different senses of aesthetics, however, each needs to establish the communicability of their sense so as not to be locked in a private aesthetics, an untenable position in any case. Each form of transdisciplinary aesthetics, I won't go through all of them, just some examples, has started from within practices outside professional philosophy, and just as often from outside the narrowly conceived concept of the art world. For example, forensic aesthetics started with the criminal investigation of Mengel's skull, which conceptually and sensorially integrated the other disciplines involved in solving this difficult case. When Mengel's skull, quote, made its appearance on the stand and on the screen as object and as image, it became a hinge, and on it, political aesthetics turned, end quote. And why aesthetics? Well, forensics is an aesthetic practice because it depends on both the modes and the means by which reality is sensed and presented publicly, end quote. Moreover, many of the forms of transdisciplinary aesthetics are generated and sustained by social political practices. For example, migratory aesthetics is motivated by the forced migration that millions of people from the Middle East, Latin America, Africa, and elsewhere are enduring for economic, social, political, military, or environmental reasons. Quote, migratory aesthetics starts with the observation of the transformations that migration produces in the aesthetic sphere of contemporary societies for migrants and subjects and resident subjects alike. To cite a second social political example, people practicing prison art and aesthetics aspire to transfer policy regarding prisons from forms of restorative justice to prison. In this context, Angela Davis argues that Critical Resistance, a prison abolition organization, needs aesthetics, in particular what she calls soft aesthetics, rather than a graphically political aesthetic. Such links to non-academic social political practices helps to clarify that the trans in transdisciplinary aesthetics signifies more than relations among academic disciplines, pointing in addition to the potential social political impact of the myriad forms of transdisciplinary aesthetics on the historical, non-academic context in which they operate. And this is the main reason why I think transdisciplinary is more accurate than interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, as fields characterized by the latter typically remain within the traditional confines of academia. Thus, aesthetics outside philosophy is transdisciplinary in the multiple senses. This is where a slide would be useful, if not elsewhere too. So aesthetics outside philosophy is transdisciplinary in multiple senses that, one, it originates beyond philosophy in a variety of artistic and non-artistic practices. Two, it extends across many academic disciplines. Three, it transcends even the most generously construed boundaries of artistic practice, limited only by the range of aesthetic experience. And four, it has transformative potential outside academia as well as inside, outside art as well as inside. To conclude, aesthetics needs to be transdisciplinary, whether it is practiced inside or outside professional philosophy. Otherwise, aesthetics inside philosophy will likely continue to shrink as philosophy continues. Otherwise, aestheticians inside philosophy will seek to be philosophically relevant because they will lose ties to the art, culture, design, everyday life, and nature that generate aesthetic questions and demand philosophical answers. Otherwise, the anti-aesthetic stance will reestablish itself, and then the new transdisciplinary forms of aesthetics will forfeit the very philosophical tools on which their own possibility, development, efficacy, and further expansion depend. Otherwise, aestheticians on both sides of the disciplinary divide of philosophy will work at cross purposes to the detriment of the artistic, socio-political, philosophical, and other issues motivating, comprising, and justifying transdisciplinary aesthetics across its many forms. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Kelly, for such an interesting talk. At the moment, we're gonna have a 5 minutes break, and then we will open the discussion.
So I welcome everyone back. We'll start a discussion now. So think about your questions. You can also raise your hands if you have any questions or write them down in the chat. In the meantime, both Nicole and I, we have questions. If I'm not mistaken, that's Young Jin, and he has a question. Yes, please.
I believe someone else raised it first, so I'm happy to concede the question to the other person first.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. Of course. You can ask your question.
Do you mean me or the other person?
I'm sorry, I just can't see the other person who raised the hand. So if you did that, maybe you can ask the question.
Yes, there we go.
Oh, I can see that's Filippo.
Me? Sorry, is it me?
Yes, Filippo.
Right. Yeah, so I have a question. I have a couple of worries for Marcos. So I mean, so I'm a philosopher, right? So you should take that into account, I guess. So I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not unsympathetic to the kinds of things that the general trust of what you were saying. I have a couple of worries. So one is you start by saying that you want to dispense with the concept of aesthetic experience, but then it doesn't look to me like that's what you're then doing. Instead, it looks more like you're saying that the concept of aesthetic experience doesn't denote a natural kind, right? So you can find aesthetic experiences in art, and you can find aesthetic experiences out in sort of ordinary life, right? But those two seem to me two very different things. One is there is no concept, and the other is there is a concept and you give a definition of the concept, the sensory experiences that give that have some hedonic value or something like that, right? And so that's good as a, I mean, to me, if you have a definition and you have a concept, then you might say, well, but that concept doesn't denote, doesn't cap nature at its joints, doesn't denote a natural kind of thing, and that's a different issue. The other worry is to do with the wording aesthetic experience. So I don't deny, I have the suspicion, so I read a lot of cognitive science, and I am interdisciplinary in the stuff that I do in philosophy, in philosophical aesthetics. But so I do have the sense that you may be right that in contemporary psychology, especially, aesthetic experience is sort of denoting artistic experience. So the experience that we have to works of art, in response to works of art or something like that. But in philosophy, so I mean, especially in the analytic tradition where I work, the aesthetic experience and artistic experience have been clearly defined for, I mean, as much as you can clearly define anything in philosophy for a while, right? So one thing is aesthetic experience, and it has more or less your definition. Even Baumgarten had more or less the focus on sensory experience as the definition of aesthetic, right? Aesthetic came from the Greek word for sensory experience, and even some of the definitions that you give at the beginning, they seem to focus on aesthetic experience. So that seems to be not much of a problem. The problem is artistic experience, right? But so the problem is conflate. So what you're arguing against, I guess, is the conflation that maybe some psychology does, but a lot of philosophy hasn't done for a while, between aesthetic experience and artistic experience.
Yeah, I'll try and work my way backwards through your questions. So as you saw in many of the definitions given by psychologists in the 20th century, in the 19th century, and even in the definitions that I showed you on the slides of the 21st century given by psychologists, you see that some do conflate the experience of art with the experience of aesthetics. So it's not just the way that I'm portraying the field. I think that just, copy-pasted definition from papers and directly quoted. So that shows basically that the philosophical notion or concept of aesthetic experience that has sort of been accepted in psychology is not a contemporary philosophical conception. It's a 19th century philosophical conception. Sort of, we inherited this idea that I explained, and then philosophy went its own way and psychology has gone its other way, and we haven't spoken ever since. Just to give a bit of a caricature of what happened. I'm not against the concept of aesthetic experience unless that means saying there are certain experiences that are very different from other non-aesthetic experiences. That's what I'm saying, that the concept of aesthetic experience, such as the ones that I gave as examples in psychological aesthetics, imply that there are certain experiences that we have that we can call aesthetic, that are different in some ways to other experiences that we have that we should not call aesthetic. And this is the difference that I question. So either we admit that every experience can have an aesthetic aspect to it, and I'd be happy with that, or we admit that this distinction doesn't make sense, and I'm also happy with that. But the basic point I wanted to make is that the psychological evidence and the neurobiological evidence doesn't justify the separation of two distinct classes of experiences, one that merits the label aesthetic and the other class that doesn't. That's basically my point.
Thank you very much, Philippe and Marcus. Jan-Jin, you had a question.
Yes, indeed I had. So my question is directed toward Marcus. So firstly, thank you very much for the insightful and encompassing talk. As a psychologist, I always welcome talks that incorporate a lot of these philosophical issues, because I think we're all invested in the same sort of questions. Now, my question concerns the particular slide that you used regarding, I think it was, I always confuse William James and Henry James, but there was this quote that you used where you talk about how words create their own kind of substance, and therefore we are kind of dividing up different kind of ideas, which in reality shouldn't be really divided up. And if I understood your logic correctly, you are using this as an example to talk about why idealistic and traditional philosophy have been kind of really not been too terribly realistic in some ways. Now, if I may use this general logic and expand upon it, could we in some ways say that we're, as psychologists, we are shooting ourselves in the foot? And the reason that I say this is because if it is true that words don't necessarily always be reflective of reality, in psychology, we're always using words as a basis of our statistical analyses. So to what degree can we say that word-based psychological studies are also biased and we're creating our own word-based realities?
That's a super question. Remember that the stuff psychologists work with are constructs. So things like personality, intelligence, aesthetic experience. These are ideas that we create that's supposed to have some sort of a substance, and it makes sense to talk about intelligence, personality, and so on and so forth, because they encapsulate a part of reality that's interesting to psychologists. Yeah. So I don't think that's any different in any field of psychology. That slide and the ones where I talked about how categories become differentiated, that's something that a psychologist we know happens, and there are many examples of experiments where groups of people are just randomly mixed, and one group of people get a red tag and another group of people get a blue tag, and that suddenly creates a distinction between these people, and the more you let those people interact, the more they'll sort of cluster into these groups, and then they'll try and make sense of why we're grouped this way and why we're grouped that way. And they'll start finding commonalities within the groups and differences from the other group. And they'll begin and exaggerate the similarities within groups and the differences between the groups. So this is just the way cognition happens. It's a basic mechanism that natural selection has given us and many other animals, which is to categorize reality. It just makes it easier for an animal to categorize stuff and go about its business in the world. And I think this is what happened with experiences. Philosophers said some experiences we'll call aesthetic, some others we won't. And psychologists took these labels and then gradually began to exaggerate the difference between aesthetic versus non-aesthetic, but also the similarities within the category of aesthetic experiences. We tend to think that it makes sense to group different kinds of aesthetic experiences as a package just because they have the same label. But if you think of it, we can have many different sorts of experiences that we would call, aesthetic. So that's the reason behind those slides.
Sure, I absolutely understand. Cool. And my concern was about whether this kind of grouping of ideas based on words, whether people can do that to themselves without these kind of social influences, such that what we might denote and we might conceptualize a certain experience as saying this, but what we're actually experiencing might be something else.
And that's why it's so important for psychologists doing research to make sure that the words they use and the concepts they rely on are doing the work that we want them to do and not opposite work.
I completely agree with you. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both. We have more questions. Sonia, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I hope my English will be quite good. Okay, my name is Sonia. I'm a PhD student at the University of Messina, Italy, and actually a visiting PhD student at Liverpool John Moores University. So my research topic includes in some way aesthetic judgment. So I'm really interested in an aesthetic experience too. So here my question. What do you think about aesthetic as our individual and social identity development? I ask this because we know that aesthetic judgment activates in the brain the default mode network, which is involved in the mind-wandering state and self-identity attention, you know. So in a nutshell, aesthetic experience could be the experience in a global way.
Thank you, Sonia. This is a question for Professor Kelly or Professor Nadal?
For both of them, it's a general question.
Yes, Professor Kelly, do you want to comment that?
Yes, maybe on that and the earlier questions. I mean, I understand. I'm obviously I'm a philosopher. I'm not a neuroscientist or a scientist of any kind. And I understand if I were a neuroscientist and I were trying to understand neural processes and so on involved in artistic experience or aesthetic experience or whatever, that I would want to be more precise about what I was studying. Like, if you're going to do fMRIs and so on, you need to know what people are focusing on in order to be able to have a study in the first place. But I think that there's a problem there, which is that a couple of things. One is that aesthetics does mean, the word aesthesis does mean sensation or perception. And there's no reason why it has to be specific to artistic sensation or perception. And so it's a very broad concept. And aesthesis actually comes even going back further etymologically, means simply to breathe. So there's a sense in which a human being alive is involved in aesthetics in a very fundamental way. This is how deep the analysis goes. And this comes out very clearly in discussions of prison aesthetics. If you ask why somebody, an activist interested in abolishing prisons, such as Angela Davis, and there are others, many others, would even talk about aesthetics at all, which to me is like asking why Frederick Douglass wrote 4 essays on picturing during the Civil War, right? While Lincoln was giving his inaugural address, and Douglass was trying to get an audience with Lincoln. He did so in part by lecturing on aesthetics. He developed an aesthetic theory to explain why pictures were fundamental as part of the abolition movement and so on. And to explain that, it seems to me one has to take a very, very broad notion of aesthetics as perception, sensation, but even as breathing. Then you need to be more precise about what is involved. In the case of prison, it's the denial of sensation that accounts for the emphasis on aesthetics. Right? I don't know how you then analyze that as a neuroscientist, but that's the kind of challenge. I did talk about the notion of aesthetic experience, but I use it in this very general sense of sensation, perception, even breathing, and so on, because that seems to be one of the reasons why there are so many different forms of what I call transdisciplinary aesthetics. And you can call it just different forms of aesthetics. Why people have turned to aesthetics. This to me is a philosophical question to explain what is happening sociologically and politically and otherwise. Another point, though, I wanted to make, Marcus, is that to me, one of the reasons why aesthetics in the modern sense developed in the 18th century is because people realized that in talking about art, they weren't talking about any specific properties of the objects, right? There were no transcendental properties, but there were also no empirical properties of the object that you could focus on, which on the one hand would say, well, then how could you start a discipline without having anything to talk about, right? Without having to talk about the properties of an object? But that's exactly what raised the philosophical issue. That's why it became a philosophical problem. So you say, okay, we're not focusing, although some try to, on the properties of the object, but we see it as, to take it as beauty, but beauty not just as a single property among others, but as a stand-in for all aesthetic properties, including its opposite, the ugly, the sublime, the abject, whatever, the dainty, whatever you want to throw in, whatever aesthetic property. So they've said, okay, it's a relational property, and that means a relation between a single subject and an object. But even more important, and this is a reflective dimension of what Kant meant by calling aesthetic judgment reflective, it was also a relation among subjects. So it was implicitly, an aesthetic judgment was implicitly already an ethical, social judgment at the same time. So it couldn't be purely individual. It wasn't simply my taste that's at stake when I make a judgment. I'm relating to an object, but I'm implicitly, if not explicitly, also relating to other people. That's the sense in which Kant says you command consent from people. Command may be a little bit strong, but you're assuming it's possible that others could consent to you because you're making a judgment to them, right? They may say you're full of whatever, but that's the context in which you're making. So judgment is, by that nature, aesthetic judgment becomes messy because it is ethical and political all at once. So a few other things, but I'll stop, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have a next question by Rick. Rick, welcome you.
Hello, thank you. I guess this question is directed maybe more towards Professor Nadal, but I'd be interested in either person's opinion. So I'm a neurobiologist who studies the visual system, mainly in monkeys, a little bit in humans. And it's just a fact in our world that the sensory inputs are inadequate for defining what's a model of the world, what's really out there in the world. And so one of the popular ways of thinking about how that problem is solved is through prior knowledge. So Bayesian would say priors. We might, neuroscientists speak of internal models. And I think this is key for me in thinking about what might be distinguished to some extent as an aesthetic sensory experience from a non-sensory aesthetic sensory experience. And even sort of knits together maybe the lowbrow and the highbrow discussions about aesthetics, in that the internal model is something that we aren't just born with. We're born with, the species has evolved parts of the internal model, like the illuminant is overhead, for example. But we are constantly building these up as we learn, right? And so my experience of the Verdi Requiem is an aesthetic one. But my wife's, I would argue, would be a heightened aesthetic experience because she's a professional musician who, by virtue of her training and by virtue of the fact that she's conducted hundreds and hundreds of other classical pieces of music, has a more sophisticated internal model with which the same sensory inputs from the orchestra and the chorus engage that. And so perception is what happens when sensory data engages our internal models. And as we engage more sophisticated, abstract parts of those internal models, we move into a more that maybe fuzzy manifold in a high dimensional space of sensory experience in general. So I guess would be interested in especially Professor Nadal's ideas, since he talked about sensation as active and predictive, what role you see for internal models in the aesthetic experience.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the very interesting question. In some of the slides I included experience, for instance, expectations. Whatever the label, I think I'm actually saying how important it is your previous experience, and that can be formal experience, like as you were saying about your wife, she has expertise in a domain. And she has many resources to think about and engage and feel about that musical piece you're listening to, which you don't have. Sometimes it's for me like listening to poetry in a language that I can't understand. I don't get the meaning of the poetry, but I can still enjoy the musicality or the rhyme and stuff like that. So I'm still enjoying, but I don't get the deep meaning of that poem. You talk about what was the label that you used? The templates. That's something that we're actually looking into now in a couple of studies that we're conducting, trying to manipulate people's working memory while they're doing aesthetic tasks, and we're giving them different, let's say, aesthetic tasks. We're asking them to judge how beautiful things are or how much they like, and see what the relevance of those internal templates are to these different tasks. So it is something that we're looking into. It's still very early to be giving a lot of information about that because we don't have much results, but it does seem, for instance, that beauty taps into working memory resources more than expressing liking. So it seems that people have more complex beauty templates than liking templates. So liking might be something more direct than beauty.
Thank you. Thank you both. And we have the question from Deirdre.
Hi, hello. So thank you both for great talks. Honestly, this is the advantage of being all digital now. We can meet all over the world. So my background is in psychology, in vision, and also a bit in art history. And I was listening to talks and I started thinking about, you know, the separate concepts of aesthetics that would be talked about, for instance, in art history very much. And then the aesthetics we talk in psychology is completely different. And then I started thinking about the terms that are used in popular culture right now, like body aesthetics and social interaction aesthetics, and it just goes beyond and beyond, beyond. I started thinking in reverse, you know, for instance, Professor Kelly, you were saying that aesthetics is a transdisciplinary, sorry, and that it's between all the topics. And I started thinking, well, what is the topic of human existence, presence, that is not actually an aesthetic experience? What if we try to define it in reverse? Yeah. I think maybe that's more for Professor Kelly.
Yes.
That's a great question, actually. It's a great question. Getting an echo as well. Okay. Because I'm hearing an echo. I don't know if you hear it on your end. Okay. I mean, if I'm saying that transdisciplinary aesthetics is based on this notion of aesthetics being perception, sensation, even breathing, and so on, it seems very amorphous. So it would be. It's a great thought to say, well, what wouldn't be included in that, right? Where wouldn't you have the sensation or perception that you could regard as aesthetic? And I think actually to go back to the prison example, I mean, I think that's one of the things, the denial of sensory deprivation, especially in isolation, right? In prison, I mean, it's the sheer absence of perception and sensation that is normally associated with everyday human life that gives rise to people saying that, well, that's wrong ethically and so on. And to explain why it's wrong ethically, they talk about what it does to the person who's deprived of their senses and so on. So that is a case where sensation is aesthetic sensation is not present, but only because it's been forcibly denied and removed or prohibited by some people. But you know, if that's the argument that they're making, then it makes the case of how fundamental the aesthetic is to everyday human life. So Marcus, when you say that aesthetic experience is just normal experience, I mean that is the case. I mean it creates problems for somebody in your field trying to be more precise about what you're studying, but you know, that's the sort of synesthetic dimension of aesthetic experience. And it's the way that Dewey talked about art as experience, right? It was the notion of an experience. So there's a flow of experience, a temporal flow of experience of human life, and there's something that breaks with that. And experience, in his view, is something which is singled out from that general flow, and it can be talked about in the heightened experience. But Dewey talks about how an experience is a disruption of the normal flow of human experience, and then the artistic dimension is trying to regain some sort of unity. And people often talk about in Dewey about the notion of unity, but I don't think you can talk about that without talking about what gives rise to the demand for unity, which is the disruption of experience. I mean, people find that's a very vague notion as well, philosophically, and I understand that. But a lot of people are picking up on that. I mean, I've been doing aesthetics for almost 40 years. I can say that there's never been as much interest in the field as there is now. I was always making an argument within philosophy and art history. I taught in art history department, making a case for aesthetics. I don't have to do that anymore. It's everywhere. I mean, again, that's an amorphous sort of issue, but it's also, it's like, having too many people at a party. I mean, what's the problem? If you run out of beer or wine, yeah, that's a problem, but it's hard to have a single conversation, etc. But there is something happening that philosophers need to respond to. And the American Society for Aesthetics and most aesthetic societies in the world I know, whereas aesthetics itself, aesthetics outside philosophy is growing. So to me, people who have a philosophical interest in aesthetics should be addressing that in some way.
Thank you both very much. We only have 2 more questions. So the first one is by Gregor.
Hi there. Hi, Marcus. My name is Gregor. I'm a researcher in experimental aesthetics in Jena in Germany, and I try to bridge psychology and philosophy, so that's exactly my topic. My question goes to Marcus. I was wondering, it's more specific on the notion of the aesthetic experience. I was wondering how much you relate your notion of the aesthetic experience, or what you came up with the evolutionary aesthetics, because you're talking about the purpose of the aesthetic experiments, or of the experience. Maybe you avoid the term aesthetic, of the experience itself, of the hedonic experience. And at least from a neuroscientific perspective, this makes completely sense to me, because in the reward system, there's no really differentiation between experiences like death or other persons, children, and so on. You talked about it. And the notion of the aesthetic experience. But in my opinion, there's a difference, because the aesthetic experience itself really does not affect my life in itself. So if I have death, it really affects how I live. And if I have an aesthetic experience, it's more like a pleasure from out of nowhere. And yeah, and it's very good for me, but not on a practical basis. So the argument that evolutionary aesthetics make is that this is kind of some kind of spandrel. So it's something that evolves with not really a purpose on it. And do I understand you correctly that this would, if it is a spandrel, if it is the same as other experiments where I moved on, we can use this kind of spandrels in experiments, in psychological experiments, and also can make some assumptions about the other experience we do not test in the we cannot test experimentally.
And another super nice question. So what I'm trying to do is imagining my field if we didn't have the concept of aesthetic experience. So what would I be interested in? And with Martin Scoe, as I said before, what we'd be interested in is the process of, or the phenomenon of, hedonic valuation. So how do animals, humans included, go about their world and decide what's good for them, what's bad for them, what should they approach, what should they avoid? So that's what we're interested in. understanding that mechanism of how perceptual stimulation gets translated through these brain circuits into value signals. So I want to approach this, or I shouldn't approach that. I'd say that's a pretty clear adaptive mechanism. You know, it enhances survival of individuals and the species. The fact that you and everybody else have these hedonic valuations that lead to very little, let's say, biological advantage, as you were describing, sort of, you know, you play. I think that's just like sex. You know, you can use sex for biological reproduction, but you can use sex for recreation. And maybe many of the people who are here, you know, the number of times we actually engage in sex for reproduction is a very small percentage of the times we engage in sex. Does that mean that's a spandrel? I don't think so. I think it's a question that humans have developed the ability to be recreational with lots of activities that other animals use basically for survival. So we play with sex, but we play with food, and we play with hedonic valuation in general. I think it isn't. I don't think it's any different to the case of sex or food. The way we, you know, are playful with food, and we decorate our dishes, and the way we like to go to nice places to eat. The fact that we give meaning to certain meals, you know, like let's go out and have a meal for our anniversary and stuff like that. I think that's the same process of enhancing our enjoyment of that, which is not necessarily for a purely biological purpose, but just to play with it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, I think we finished with questions. Nicole?
So yes, thank you both for this interesting discussion. I guess what I wanted to, because I'm conscious of time now. So what I highlighted between the two of you, you both referenced well, Marcus, you showed the art wall with the portrait of George Floyd, and then Professor Kelly, you highlighted how most of the research on aesthetics is focused on Western culture. So I was wondering if you, if you both could comment on that and how we can move forward as a discipline to integrate something that is not merely centered on Western culture.
Well, that's a big question, but some of the examples I could give of transdisciplinary aesthetics would involve what African aesthetics, for example. I mean, understanding that there's no such thing, since there's no such thing except the general sense of the continent, but there is interest in aesthetics. I think, Marcus, you mentioned how in some places, whatever, art is tied more to tradition and practices and so on. But I mean, now in a global world, I mean, I was supposed to be spending a couple of months in the summer in Senegal and other places exploring this kind of question about the kind of the models of aesthetics that's outside the Western. So back up. If one problem with aesthetics is that it's Eurocentric, racist, et cetera, then what are alternatives? Well, there are critiques of aesthetics within contemporary analytic and content philosophy, but they remain within that same framework. So how do you get outside of this? And this is where you kind of other the others by looking for their alternative models. But if aesthetics is as basic as perception and sensation, then one should expect to find aesthetics in other places. And the question is how, whether they understood it and practiced it in ways that would be helpful as we pursue these kinds of questions.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I guess to kind of wrap up and for the benefit of early career researchers, we'd like to ask you both if you'd like to share with us some well, why you became interested in this topic, first thing first, or perhaps some experience that was critical at the beginning of your career to make you, that shaped you as a researcher, and perhaps to reflect on why maybe the aesthetics has been kind of marginalized so far. Well, I guess especially in the field of psychology.
These are the questions that I really love. So I got involved in aesthetics because it turned out that I wasn't good at anything else. So I tried doing psychology of language and utterly failed, although I'm still fascinated by psycholinguistics and stuff like that. And the other field of research that my PhD supervisor was engaged in was aesthetics. So he said, why don't you go into aesthetics? I said, well, okay. So it was sort of, for me, it was a rebound. But I found it fascinating. And I sort of landed in empirical aesthetics at the time neuroaesthetics was sort of taking off. And that was a very lucky moment for me because I was sort of witness and participant of that very initial moment of neuroaesthetics. And probably related to your previous question, one of the most significant realization moments for me was we organized an expedition to Africa, and we spent some time sort of, I'd say, doing cultural tourism with different people in Tanzania. And being interested in psychological aesthetics, I tried to understand why the people we were going with wore certain necklaces with certain patterns. So I asked our translator to ask the other translator to ask that person who was wearing the necklace whether he found that necklace or the pattern beautiful. So he translates English into Swahili and Swahili into Hadza, and then the answer comes back, and the answer is, well, this necklace protects us against snakes when we go out hunting. So I told my translator, no, that's not my question. So please ask again whether he finds this necklace beautiful. And the answer comes back again, yeah, this protects us against snakes when we hunt. So, said forget it, because, obviously the translator isn't conveying my question correctly. But then it dawned on me that it's not the translator that wasn't conveying the question correctly, it's the question doesn't make sense to them. There's no beauty that it's abstract from the usefulness of that pattern. So beauty to them is the protection. That pattern is beautiful because it protects them against snakes when they go hunting. So that for me was a real turning point, because I was hoping to do psychology because I'm interested in humans, not because I'm interested in Europeans.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's definitely a very interesting experience. How may I ask to you, Professor Carli? Well, can I ask your point of view and your why you became interested in this topic?
Sure. I mean, when I was in graduate school, I was mainly interested in aesthetics, but in combination with critical theory and hermeneutics, because I studied with both Latimer and Habermas. But when I came to, and that was my initial proposal, I had a conversation with my advisors, one of whom was Mark Swiatkowski, the main person, and he said something like, well, you can shoot yourself in one foot by doing critical theory and hermeneutics, which weren't at the time and still aren't very popular within the philosophical profession. But if you do aesthetics as well, then you've shot yourself in your other foot, and unless you have a third one, you better reconsider. So I didn't. I wrote on critical theory and hermeneutics, and I dropped the aesthetics. I did the ethics. And it turned out to be, it was an unfortunate thing to have to do, but it was actually a great thing for me to do because I continued my interest in aesthetics. I mean, I read things in philosophy, but I also read more things in art history and art, and I worked with artists on various projects and so on. And I developed a sense of aesthetics that separate from the philosophical field. And then when I, later on, I was teaching and working at Columbia, and Arthur Danto was asked about doing an encyclopedia of aesthetics, and he said, yeah, somebody should do that. You should ask Michael because he's interested in it. Well, nobody in the profession would have known that I was particularly interested in aesthetics because I wasn't doing that within the field, right? But he knew it because we shared other interests and so on. And, you know, that then opened up that, you know, what I've been doing for the past 20 years or more. And, you know, so in a strange way, being not being able to do what I wanted to do in philosophy enabled me to do what I wanted to do with philosophy. Now that doesn't translate very well, not in Swahili or anything else. I mean, you know, it's not really advice to somebody, but the underlying part of it is that, you know, if you go into academia, you have to really love what you're doing, regardless of what the field likes or doesn't like. And in the case of transdisciplinary aesthetics, I think there are opportunities to work with people in other fields. I think there's more willingness to do that. I mean, you can work with, you know, evolutionary aesthetics. People mentioned, I mean, Richard Crum has this interesting book on the evolution of beauty, and it ends with this kind of invitation of reaching out to try to pull people in aesthetics into what he's trying to do. That birds create various things, nest and do dances and other things and songs. They have nothing to do with survival, and in fact, many of them seem to be counter their own survival chances. So why people doing this? So I think there's opportunities, and if you're in Europe, I've also been involved in the European Research Council for the last few years, and you know, there are a lot of research opportunities and funding. I mean, in the United States, there's no way you're going to get a 5-year, $2 million grant to work with a team of people doing something like this. But my advice there would be to develop the relations, so a transdisciplinary team of people as soon as you can, and then apply for something. A lot of people apply for these grants and said, you know, I'm doing it in philosophy, but I'd really like to go talk to Marcus Nadal. Let me write to him for the first time as I apply for this grant. Those are the unconvincing ones. But if I had that relationship with research and so on with various people, like all 6 of you, Marina, Nicole, everybody, Sonia, all the people I can see, and then I applied for it, there are serious research opportunities, funding for this kind of work. That I would encourage people to take advantage of that. I wish I could say it was possible in the United States, but you know the ship isn't going on here, so that's not happening.
Well, thank you very much for such an interesting insight. I think that, yeah, definitely these are the questions that kind of reveal a bit more what's the work behind the ideas that we discussed and presented so far. I think, yeah, the time is up. So I'd like to thank again our speakers and everyone who attended here and for such a great discussion. And perhaps I'd just like to remind everyone that we will have the next meeting, the 19th of February, about Sublime. And yeah, Marina, would you like to add anything else?
I just want to thank you all. It was very interesting, a very interesting discussion.